Bulawayo in southern Rhodesia. And that's where he was pushing cars and meeting up with other people who were in his situation. They'd wait outside the movie houses for people to come out. Most of them had cars that had trouble starting, so they used to earn a bit of pocket money that way. But it appears that my father had learned to drive a car still in Europe, because I have a photograph somewhere of him sitting in a car. I don't know whether he actually learned or whether he taught himself without a license, who knows. But he was able to drive a car, certainly, and that stood him in very good stead, because in 1930, they stayed in Bulawayo, where my one sister, Jane, who's still alive and lives in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, she'll be 91 this year, was born. And they stayed there, and after Jane was born in 1930, they moved to Livingston in northern Rhodesia. Livingston was a town on the border between southern Rhodesia and northern Rhodesia, where the Victoria Falls is. Okay, Livingston was on the northern side of the bridge, and Bulawayo was in southern Rhodesia, but there were other places on the way. Okay, Bulawayo was a much bigger city. Let's say that. In 1931, we'll get back to that. 1931, or very early in 1931, because my sister was born in November 1930. And I know that they moved after she was born, so I think it must have been fairly early in 1931. My father moved to Livingston. At that stage, he could drive, so he became a taxi driver. He managed to buy a car or get a car, and did quite well, and eventually had his own taxi service, where he employed other taxi drivers, all of whom were black taxi drivers, because there was very seldom a white taxi driver in that part of Africa in those days. But he had a good taxi service. And my mother was on the telephone when they phoned for a taxi. My mother did all the organizing of the taxis. He used to go, now the story becomes interesting. Because he was a taxi driver, he used to go to the station in Livingston, which was on the border between northern and southern Rhodesia. And people going from southern to northern Rhodesia had to be investigated by the authorities there. They couldn't just go through. They had to have permission to go through, also to declare customs and that sort of thing. And because he was a taxi driver and he was going every morning to meet the train in order to solicit business, he became very friendly with the people working at the station there, in the customs and in the other departments, immigration department and so on. And that was at a very useful time in Jewish history, because very soon after, the Jews from Lithuania and other parts of Europe were fleeing from what we all know what that became then, but the nonsense there was starting already. It was early in the 1930s, and they used to have to register when they came to the border. What happened is most of them had fled hoping to live in South Africa. South Africa said, no, you're Jews, we've got enough Jews. And then they tried southern Rhodesia, and sometimes some were allowed to stay, and those that weren't allowed to stay got onto the train and traveled to northern Rhodesia. Now, I have to tell you, at that time, the authorities in northern Rhodesia were looking for white immigrants, white. So even Jews were accepted, whereas South Africa and southern Rhodesia was putting, down a little bit. Yes, they were not. As long as your skin was white, we'll even accept Jews. That's the thing. So they were on their way to northern Rhodesia, firstly because they could get in, and secondly, there were copper mines. In the copper belt of northern Rhodesia were copper mines, and they needed people to work on the copper mines. They had lots of black people, but they had very few white people to do administration and things. At that stage, the black people weren't very educated. Okay, so they needed these people. And that made it easy for these whites to get into northern Rhodesia. And I might mention that I read somewhere, somebody who did a history of the Jews of northern Rhodesia, that if the world Jewish authorities had realized how easy it was for their Jews to get in, they could have saved thousands of people who were killed in the Holocaust. But they didn't know, or they weren't told, or they didn't investigate, and that didn't happen.